Okay, hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about speech. So we've been talking mostly about text or maybe unspecified, but speech is pretty important. It's how we actually communicate. Text is a secondary medium that we've learned to use, and you have to explicitly learn it for the most part. Speech is the most natural form of communication, and it's the most common, even if it's not the most recorded. We would like to be able to process speech as well as what we process text. And in fact, maybe even we like to do that more, especially for low resource languages where literacy may not be as strong as what it is in the higher resource languages. So before we actually get into computational aspects of speech, I'd like to actually talk about the physical aspects of speech and how we generate speech and how we listen to speech, because it tells us a lot about what we need to do if we want to build computational models. So speech is generated from your vocal tract, that's your mouth and throat. You blow air out of your lungs into your vocal tract. It may vibrate your larynx so that you can get so-called voiced speech, so ah and e, rather than unvoiced speech like sh, which doesn't have the vibration. You can control that. And by positioning your tongue, teeth, lips, and velum, the opening that goes up into your nasal passage, you can control the types of noises that are actually coming out of your mouth. And over time, we've managed to recognize these and sequences of these into words and phrases and ideas and jokes even. So that's quite impressive. But what we want to do from the computational point of view is understand that space of different positions that you could put your vocal tract and aspects of your tongue, teeth, lips, etc., and how you actually generate things. So what actually happens coming out of your mouth is a bunch of pressure waves that have got different frequencies that are coming out that then go off and bounce off the walls and come back to your ears. This is assuming that we were actually sitting in the same room, and it doesn't bounce off the walls until it gets to a microphone on my laptop and then gets broadcast to you. But the bouncing off the walls means there's actually multiple examples of the waveform file coming to your ear, and it's not just a clear single signal. There's echo, which your brain is very good at getting rid of. So we have a lump of meat, we blow air through it, noises come out of it, and these noises mean something. So what happens at the end, at the other end, the ear? Well, the ear actually is aware of different pressures that are actually happening. And inside your ear, you have an eardrum, and your eardrum's very like a microphone, except it's the other way around. A microphone's very much like an ear. We had ears before we had microphones. And what happens is your eardrum vibrates at the same rate as what these air pressure vibrations are coming into your ear. Okay, actually, the shape of your ear allows you to not only capture things, noises, but also get some directional information about whether things are coming before you or afterwards. Your two ears actually are pretty good at being identified where the noise is coming from, roundabout, actually mostly on a plane. It's not very good doing up and down things. But in your ear, the eardrum's going to vibrate, and within there, there's a small bone that will be forced to vibrate, and that bone is connected to a very interesting organ called the cochlea. The cochlea is this spiral form which contains fluid, and round the outside of the cochlea is a whole bunch of hairs all the way through the cochlea. And what happens, partly because of its spiral form, is that depending on the frequency of the vibration that are coming in, different hairs are stimulated. Now, what that really means is depending on the vibrations that are coming in, these vibrations are effectively decomposed into their frequency components within your cochlea. Cochlea is then connected to the audio nerve, and it goes into the brain and does magic to try to differentiate between these different noises. But rather importantly, the cochlea is decomposing the signal into its frequency components. Now, in math, this is called a Fourier transform. And basically, this any natural signal can be decomposed into the sum of weighted sine waves. And that's actually what your ear is doing too. And because your ear is doing it, this is something that we should be doing in computational work as well, because that's actually what the ear hears. It doesn't hear things in the time domain, it hears things in the frequency domain. I should point out that there's a relatively common disability where the cochlea is malformed, it particularly has no fluid in it. And this actually makes humans profoundly deaf. They cannot hear through their ear, they can still hear vibration through the rest of their body, as we all do. Um, and in the 90s, we actually started being able to make synthetic cochlea. And so what we would do is build a little microprocessor that would take, and a microphone, and would take the forms and decompose things, a Fourier transform, and then attach the output of that into the audio nerve. And at least to begin with, doing this in pre-vocal children, younger than 18 months, these children could learn to hear not as well as people who had normal cochlea, but pretty well compared to being profoundly deaf, and continue normal lives. And that was one of the early successes in speech processing, where artificial cochlea actually allowed the replacement of that to allow people to actually hear. If you go on YouTube, you'll probably see some very moving videos of people, children, and nowadays adults hearing for the first time or hearing after they've been unable to hear for a long time, by providing artificial cochlea. So how did we get from these noises that we're making from our mouth into speech that can be understood and that we can tell Alexa to switch on the lights or switch off the lights or whatever we tell Alexa to do? Somehow these different noises have to be recognized, and we'd really like to so understand the number of units, the number of segments that we have in that space. It's fundamentally an analog space, and actually it's not really segmental. So it's not really that you can split it into segments, but for first approximation, we pretend that we can. We have defined in the linguistic space what we call phonemes. These phonemes are these segments. The definition is that if we change them to some other phoneme, we may get a different word. So, for example, we have the word pat. If we change the p to a b, we get the word bat. So, p and b in English are different phonemes because if you change them, you can get a different word. That definition isn't wonderful, but it's the definition that we have. And it's quite hard to be more exact than that because there's lots of variation on how people actually say phonemes. So the phoneme r, r, has got lots of realizations across different dialects of English. So it's sort of hard to really do it. And remember, some of these definitions may actually be different phonemes in different languages, so they may actually have separation. How many sounds are there? Well, there's an infinite number, but actually, when it comes down to it, there's not hundreds, but there's scores, many 20s. And within a single language, it's probably between 20 and 80. But overall, depending on your full definition, it's probably still less than the 200. So it's a relatively small, finite amount. The International Phonetic Alphabet, IPA, tries to define them all, and it does much better than anything else. There are some marginal cases where it's not clear it's capturing exactly what it is, but for the most case, it does very, very well to be able to do that. And it does it in a very structured way. So even when there's some ambiguity, you can talk explicitly about that ambiguity and that variance. Yeah, the problem is everybody does something that's slightly different, and it can be quite acceptable to have that difference. But we want to make sure that we have these standard definitions so we can actually start doing, in this case, phonology, but in our case, computational phonology. Here's the IPA breakdown for Hindi. We saw this before when I gave the language in 10 way earlier, and we've seen this in many in the language in 10. There's a vowel chart on the left-hand side there. where it's a continuous space, but within there, there's going to be points which identify different vowels. And although it's continuous, and when people speak, for the most part, they're going to pick somewhere near the center. But of course, these centers are going to be different across different languages. That's why it's often hard when you're hearing another language, especially the distinctions in the vowel. And it's like, yeah, that sounds the same to me, because you might not be used to those distinctions. Okay. On the right hand side, we have um, the consonant chart, and what we have is along left to right, we have the place of articulation. And for the most part, we're talking from the lips going further back down the throat. So we talk about the labials first. So things like p in the second row, we have the stops, pt, and different types of t, because actually we have a lot of these in Hindi compared to other languages. English usually conflates many of these. Um, so we've got lips, teeth, retroflex, palatal, velar, uvular, and actually we can have other things down the back of the throat like um, a, and then top to bottom in there, we have manner, as we usually talk in them. So we talk about the plosives and affricates and stops, as we're actually talking about various ways of blowing air and often stopping it. We have the flaps and trills and the liquids, so things like L and R and W. We have the fricatives, so fricative has got f in it, so that's an example of a fricative. And so we have these things that we are actually looking at. There are more than this, but this is a good way to try and break down what it is. And different languages will have things in these boxes. We're probably defining in IPA that there could be something in each of these boxes, though some of them are incredibly rare and maybe don't exist at all. But we're saying is there's not anything outside these boxes. And for the most part, that's actually true. English speakers, even within the same dialect and even the same speaker in different situations, have got lots of variations. So it's not the case that everybody or every time you say shh, you say it in exactly the same way. We have complex things like borrowed phonemes that basically come from other languages that people may do in different forms. In English, we could talk about the phoneme that's in the word loch, which most English speakers can't pronounce properly because it's just not in their dialect. It's in Scots and a few other Northern Irish. It's sort of Germanic because it is Germanic. And some people will say that in different ways, but some people will say it and some people won't. There's also potentially new phonemes, as there are phonemes that sort of disappear from the language. The new phonemes in English are potentially, it's not a phoneme yet, but it's very close to it. In American English, the word water, that middle T is pronounced as what's called a flap, rather than as a clear T. So a Brit will always say the word water, although they might say water with a glottal stop and actually not have the clear T, especially in dialect. But that American flap is almost necessary now. And for those of you that learned to say the word water when you were learning English, since you've come to the US, you've probably learned that you should say water. Because that's what actually works. That's not a phoneme yet. If you do say the word water, it's not considered to be a different word yet, but definitely 50 years down the line, it's probably going to be distinctive. Likewise, phonemes that disappear, the f phoneme, the aspirated f, distinct from w, as we have the distinctions in things like Wales, a principality in the UK, where Cardiff is, or whales, the big mammal in the sea, so Wales, whales. Now in standard English, we do not have a distinction between that first phoneme. 30 years ago we did, and if you listen to people on the radio or TV from 30, 40 years ago, especially people who are speaking carefully, newsreaders, they will have a distinction there. Also, some people conflate things. American English usually conflates these three words, Mary, Mary, and Marry. Oops, I've misspelt the last one. The last one is supposed to be about weddings. And people don't distinguish them using American English, but in British English, Indian English, Australian English, they're distinguished. They're pronounced in a different way, but they're put together in American English, and it doesn't matter. People don't get confused by it mostly. They have more jokes because they can talk about Merry Christmas in a way that Brits don't understand. But that's common within dialects. Actually, some Americans have got two distinctions there, but it's very rare for them to have three. Other languages make other distinctions. Okay, so they split things up in different ways. And so for things for English speakers that they put together, such as aspirated and unaspirated stops, English speakers do generate those all the time, but they don't treat them as being phonetically different, i.e. give a different word, while Hindi speakers, most of the northern Indic languages do that. We saw Korean does that as well last week. These phonological list of segments might or might not be comprehensive. Often there's a sort of standard dialect form, or it might actually even be a standard form in well pronounced speech rather than casual speech. And it might be that we want to distinguish that when we're actually trying to build real systems. Okay. And we might want to have segments within our phoneme list that maybe aren't properly in the language, but really help us to be able to do computational work. We may also want to deal with borrowed forms. So for example, in Hindi, there is certain vowels like it's not actually native, but actually most Hindi speakers say it. So you probably want to include it in the same way that if you were dealing with German, there's also no w. It would natively be a v. But maybe you want to include that because most German speakers don't say Washington anymore. They will say Washington. And so you should include that because there's going to be lots of borrowed forms. So maybe we want to extend that when we're doing speech recognition or text-to-speech. Foreign borrowed phonemes could be incredibly common, and sometimes we don't even identify them as being foreign anymore because they're just so common in the language. And so you should be aware of that. And especially if there's code switching, you want to care about that. But speech is not just a string of phonemes. Okay, sometimes we call them phones in speech processing to try to distinguish them phonemes because we're using things that are not necessarily the linguistic phonemes, and we'd like to step back from that. We also have other things that happen. A good example is tones in Mandarin. They change the meaning of the word. Normally at this point, I ask the audience to give me the four distinctions of pronunciation of ma, which can mean mother, hemp, horse, or a form of insult. But I'm not going to do that. But ask your Chinese friends, or if you are Chinese, you know exactly what these distinctions are. And we don't have anything like that. Well, we have lexical stress where the word project and project can be distinguished by whether we put the stress on the first syllable or the second syllable. And that distinguishes nouns and verbs. Some other languages have got lexical accents. They call them to distinguish between, for example, in Japanese, hashi and hashi. One means bridge and one means chopsticks, and you've got to get it right, although some dialects flip them over. There can be other things that are not quite, well, they don't exist in English, and therefore they're thought to be unusual, but of course to the native speakers of the languages that include them are not important. So we can have something like and we maybe have that in English with the schwa. We can have ejective stops, so p and t, which exist in some languages. We have clicks, which actually some languages have multiple clicks. We can also have voice quality aspects, which can be phonetic. So I can't do that very well. But how you're actually pronouncing it can make a distinction. And of course, we have prosody. And prosody is incredibly important. And without prosody, not only would speech be incredibly boring, but actually there's lots of extra information that are in the intonation, the duration, the phrasing, and the power. So it's how people speak. It's not just what they're actually saying. So I'm going to give you an example here. What we have here on this line is a plot of the F0. The F0 is the fundamental frequency in speech, and it's the thing you effectively use for singing with. The thing that goes up and down there. And what we're doing is really plotting the frequency of the larynx vibration, the vocal folds vibration in your throat. Now, when we're speaking, that's going to vary somewhere between 80 and 350 hertz. For males, it's probably going to be about 80 to 150. And for females, it's going to be higher. And this is because, at least naturally, you have a lot of control over it. So rest form. Women have a shorter vocal tract in general. Okay, this is partly because the male head is bigger, um, again, on average, and also at puberty, the larynx actually moves further down the throat, which actually extends the vocal tract in males compared to females, and therefore, by default, they have a longer vocal tract. Therefore, by default, it's easier for them to have a lower pitch. But there's lots of control and there's lots of variation that's actually going on this. Looking at this, it starts at 300 and goes down to 100. 300 is quite high for a male, so this is probably a female speaker. 100 is quite low for a female speaker, which means this is an authoritative speaker. The lower the pitch, the more authoritative it is. And that's not because males are more authoritative than females. It's just like bigger animals are more authoritative than little animals. So, an elephant making a noise is more threatening than a mouse making a noise. And that's probably why we perceive that. And that's probably why questions rise at the end. They often don't, but when they do, there's an uncertainty and it makes it less threatening than a full statement. In our society, newsreaders are usually selected to be authoritative. They're telling you the news, they're not passing on gossip mostly. So this is probably a newsreader. The other piece of information that we can get from this bump here is on the word finance and not on the word Boston. So the person's reading, Jeff Conley heads the Boston Finance Commission. So they're focusing on finance. They are not focusing on Boston. Therefore, Boston is already in the context. It's not a new word. Therefore, the speaker who's saying that is in Boston or already introduced Boston into the conversation. They don't say Jeff Conley heads the Boston Finance Commission, so they're not contrasting with a Pittsburgh Finance Commission. So there's information that's in here that tells me this is a female newsreader from Boston. So let's just listen to it.
Jeff Conley heads the Boston Finance Commission, a watchdog agency created by the city charter.
Now, I of course know the answer to this, so I'm cheating a little bit, but that information that's in the F0 is really important. And if you want to synthesize, you want to be able to get that right. Otherwise, you'll confuse your listener. And if that information is coming in, you can use that information to get other information than just looking at what the words are. Okay. Now, there's more than just phonemes. There are syllables, and syllables are actually much better defined in languages than often what words and phonemes are. And a syllable always has a vowel. It always has a vowel. That's sort of the first definition. And for the most part, there's a bunch of consonants that appear before and a bunch of consonants that appear afterwards. Pre-vocal consonants are referred to the onset. Post-vocal consonants are called the coda. The vowel is a nucleus, and sometimes we talk about the vowel and the coda as being a rhyme. Words, well, words don't have spaces, and like, oh my God, how are we going to find it? Well, we don't have spaces in lots of other languages in the written form, like Chinese and Japanese and Thai. So we have to find some other different definition. Native speakers are very good at telling you where the word boundaries are. They're pretty consistent. They're not 100% consistent, but that's true in English as well. It's not clear whether New York is one word or two words. Again, depends on what you're doing. If you're looking at text, it really is two words. If you're looking at speech, it's not one word. So if you look where boundaries happen, if you look where people can insert boundaries, it tells you lots of information about words. But words are longer than phonemes, and they're usually syllables or multiple syllables. Sometimes they can be smaller than syllables, but that's usually not in isolation. Apostrophe S is probably a word in English, but it's mostly not pronounced as a full syllable. What happens in computer speech? We've been talking about human speech. Well, we have to digitize it because it's analog. And how often do we sample it? Well, at least 8,000 times a second, 8 kilohertz. Telephone speech, which still exists, although we don't really have telephones in the same sense, are 8 kilohertz. It probably doesn't matter in speech above 16 kilohertz, although sometimes we'll do more than that. So things like Zoom and Skype, so-called wideband or high quality, will often be at 16 kilohertz. And it makes a big difference for speech recognition of whether you're dealing with 8 or 16 kilohertz. So, and if your data is different, it makes a big difference, okay? Also be aware that higher frequencies disappear the older you get. And when I say older, I mean above the age of about 14, 15. So all of you are already losing high pitch frequencies. Mostly it doesn't matter because there's not much up there. Yes, if you're working with dolphins, it's a bit of a pain because you lose your ability to distinguish some of the noises they make. But for the most part, this is okay. And speech rarely distinguishes things at the high frequencies. Actually, at 8 kilohertz, S and F, so that's the word, the phoneme that begins at the beginning of the word Sierra and the phoneme that begins at the word Foxtrot. Notice we have words to distinguish S and F that people know because often it's hard to be able to understand the distinctions on the telephone. They're not very well distinguished at 8 kilohertz, and so often there will be errors there. Also, microphone quality. So where the microphone is, if it's immediately next to the lips, this is good. Okay, if it's sitting on the desk and the person's moving about, that's much harder. We so-called far field, and often we end up with multiple microphones to try and work out where the noise is coming from, and things like your phone actually does that. It's got multiple microphones in it. And the Alexa has got interesting array microphones inside it. But context, the outside context, not just the microphone, makes a big difference. Read speech is much clearer, much more defined, much easier to do speech recognition with, much easier to synthesize and copy. Performed careful speech like broadcast news, studio quality recording is much easier to process. And often you get that because radio announcements, TV announcements, you can get that. Quiet office is relatively easy, but as soon as you go outside, you get one, different acoustics of reverberation will actually happen around outside other noises that are happening. So cars going by make things actually much harder for machines to be able to understand it. Actually, it's true for humans too, but we're good at adaptation for that. Having other human noises around also makes it really, really hard. In fact, because they're confusable, because they're at the same frequency, makes it substantially harder. So having cars and jets and trains going by is not, even when they're loud, is not as bad as having other people, human babble around is actually much harder. But style of speech also makes a big difference. When you talk to a machine, you talk in a different way than when you're talking with a human. So in other words, recognizing speech when somebody's talking to a machine is much easier than recognizing speech if it's human-human conversation. And when you're talking to your friends, I don't need to, I'm not trying to imply that your friends are not human. When you're talking to your friends as opposed to somebody you don't know, you also speak in a very different way. And that makes speech recognition much, much harder. And of course, drunk with friends, emotional, busy outside cafe with a far field microphone, speech recognition really sucks for that. And lots of tricks have to be done in order to try to make that work. Lots of noise cancellation, knowing who the speaker is, knowing when they're actually speaking and not accidentally recognizing other noises are going on, and not actually caring about the content because you're drunk anyway. It makes it easier to pretend that the recognition is quite good. Speech is not text. They're different. They're not even really the same language. They might be dialects of each other, but they're not the same thing. In the same way that text is not speech, it's not written speech. These things are different. And many languages actually have a very strong distinction between them and think it weird that you think it's the same. English has a fairly standard difference as languages go, but if you think about things like Arabic, they actually call them two different things. So modern standard Arabic is the written form and the Arabic dialects are the spoken form, and they're not the same, and nobody thinks they're the same. Many languages even have different grammar, different registers, the way you speak, different morphology. Maybe the morphology is stricter when it's actually written. English, for example, in speech has more first person, has more present tense, while text is more third person and more past tense. But of course, that's if you think of the world as being Penn Treebank from the Wall Street Journal. Of course, written broadcast news is more third person because it's reporting things. Maybe if you look at social media, it's different. But it's very clear that the word I appears more in speech than what it appears in written form, really. Yes, it appears in written form, but it's nowhere near as common. Historically, writing was, just a different language. It was Latin, or Sanskrit, or ancient Chinese, and of course, it's not the same as speech. And people never thought that. And we, especially in the literate world, think that it is related. But remember, many people speak languages that they don't write. That doesn't mean that they don't write at all, but it means that they write in a different language compared to sometimes what they speak. And I know all of the Indians in the audience are already aware that all of them are much more confident in writing and reading in English because they do it a lot more than their own native regional language, which they speak completely fluently, but they don't write very often. Tamil has a strong distinction between its written form and its spoken form, and it's drifting even more apart. Social media is pretty interesting because it's much closer to written speech. It might actually be something in between, but it is much closer to how people actually speak. It's very interesting from the research point of view that we can get that. It's much more casual because it's often aimed at only a few people rather than lots of people, so it's not as well edited. The speech technologies that we care about are speech recognition, so speech to text. Oh, right, we're talking about text here, and there's a fairly strong view that speech is something to do with text, even though we'll see in later lectures that we'll also want to deal with languages that just don't have a written form. Text to speech, we'll also talk about that. So speech synthesis, where we're generating hopefully fully understandable, not sounding like a robot speech. Spoken dialogue systems are using these technology to actually try to achieve a task, or maybe not a task, because we sometimes just want to do casual chat, but actually that's a task too. And often it's, even though casual chat is often talked about as non-text, task oriented, it really is a task of passing the time or building up rapport or something like that. We also do speaker ID, so identifying who is speaking, and most people immediately think about, oh, passwords, but you should never use your voice as a password because in the speech synthesis thing, we can fake it completely. So never feel that that's actually safe. Sometimes it's convenient, and actually you sort of use your voice as a password in the sense that if you ever say on a telephone, if you ever just use a telephone without video, if you say, it's me, then the other person should be able to identify who it is. It's probably somebody who knows you well. But much more often we do what's called diarization. So we have some set of speech and there's lots of people speaking at once and we want to know who said what. We want to know that, David said, I'll do that, because we want to know afterwards who said I'll do that. And so we'd like to know who that person was, or who the person said, I don't understand, can you explain it to me, because we want to explain it to them. So diarization is the word diary, to be able to work out what's going on. But we also want to care about how people speak, not just what they say. So expressive speech is important, both recognition and synthesis. We like to generate, compassionate speech, command speech, also deal with the level of confidence, saying, it's not clear. That is important. Emotion, who's angry, who's lying, who is genuine. That's important. If you think about analyzing data from call centers, you want to know whether they're angry or not, because it's telling you, and whether they can be calmed down. These things are actually quite important. And so it's not the words that are telling you it, it's actually something else. Where do you get your data from? Well, there's actually only a very small number of languages that actually have significant amounts of data. And by significant, I mean thousands of hours of speech. Hundreds of hours will sort of do for most of the speech recognition stuff, probably, but you've got to get it in the right style as well. Okay, so telephone, wideband, conversational, maybe even, and also right distribution of male, female, age, dialect, verb, well-defined broadcast news speech. There are lots of central repositories that care about that. LDC, part of UPenn, and ELRA in Europe do this, and they do many of the major languages, especially the ones that we've been working on. And sometimes there's lots of minor languages as well, because there've been various projects and people distribute with that. There's a bunch of open source sites, VoxForge, OpenSLR, which is actually growing and doing much, much better. Universities in the target geographies will often try to do it. They'll try to build speech technology for their local languages. Found data is often what we end up with when we're dealing with particular languages, especially low resource languages. And so YouTube, Todo, the Chinese equivalent, often have recordings, sometimes with transcripts, maybe it's subtitles. Actually, movies can be quite good, but movies often have background music in them because that's what movies do. So although you have speech and you have subtitles, and sometimes the subtitles in other languages and not the native languages being spoken, but that can still be quite useful. The music often makes it harder to do the recognition. And removing the music is sort of possible, but it's another task that has to be done. Audiobooks are great if you can find them. They're surprisingly hard to find beyond the top forms. Often low resource languages are also low literate languages, and therefore you'd think audiobooks would be more common, but actually it can be quite hard to actually find them. Religious texts, the Bible, Quran, and of course the other religious texts, Linux manuals, are very common. You don't get read Linux manuals. It's always just text. But the Bible and Quran are often available in a spoken form. Again, low literacy in the language, and though people are willing to do that, and therefore you'll find on YouTube. And in fact, we found on Bible.is lots of examples of this, and the CMU Wilderness dataset has 700 languages, about 20 hours each. That used to be a lot of data. It's not now, but it definitely allows you to bootstrap. So it's aligned data, so you have transcriptions per verse in the Bible. And it's also a process that allows us that if you have text and you have speech, it will try to do the alignment, which is not hard, but it's not utterly trivial. And so we have the ability to do that. So sometimes there's data there that would allow you to start bootstrapping maybe other news reports, etc. So sort of in conclusion, speech is different from text. We shouldn't think it the same thing. And even more when we're doing this for low resource languages, there's probably a bigger distinction, especially if there's less literacy in the language. Speech is speech, it's not text. And so we want to take care about that. And so it might even be best to treat it as not text at all. Speech has phones, syllables, and words, but there's prosody too, and don't forget it. Often in speech recognition, we sort of don't care about prosody. In speech synthesis, we really care about prosody and have to model it, but actually both we could do with trying to get a little bit more meaning out of that. The channel, the type of microphone, the context really makes a big difference on how easy you can do it. If you can place things in quiet forms, it's much easier. The data is only good for high economic languages. I mean, it's also, for the most part, multi-speaker, where there's lots of speakers, but there is some data for other languages, and mostly, you can collect your own or you can search on the net, and it can get harder and harder and harder to find the stuff. And even once you find it, it may be hard to process to get it in, and it might be easier to collect it yourself. Speech processing is always better for the high literate languages. And actually, most of the time, we really are thinking about it as a transfer or an alternative method for text rather than speech on its own. But actually, speech is way more important in the low literate languages because they are not literate. And that might be the primary method of communication is speech, rather than sending short messages. People don't do that. And maybe we should be caring more about speech for the low literate languages than the high literate languages. Okay, And finally, for the discussion point today, again, not something to read, but something to talk about, I'd like to find examples of differences between written forms and spoken forms in the language. Okay. Um, so think about the languages you know and languages you know of, and think about differences between things that are written. Find some utterances that do not have a good written form. There's almost always a written form, but think about some utterances that would be very hard to write down, but everybody in the language understands what these noises probably are. Okay. Also, find some written forms that don't have clear spoken forms. So sometimes the written form, word for word, isn't what you would actually say if you were saying it out loud. Okay, so think of some examples for that. And then see if you can classify these. Is it not a word because it's the noise you make when you successfully complete um, a skateboard task appropriately? You do your somersault and you say something that probably isn't written well. Is there grammatical variation? Okay, is it dialect? Is it not proper something? Are there other things? Okay, so that's what we'd like you to do. Okay, thank you.